Doesn't it feel great to play a fancy tactical combination and win a game? Of course it does. We all love that feeling. But you know what? To get ourselves into that position in the first place, we need to make sure that we don't blunder, that our opponent doesn't play some nasty tactical shot against us. In today's video, I'll be sharing some of the most common tactical patterns that you absolutely must be aware of if you're playing 1d4. These patterns are mostly from the perspective of what the player with the black pieces can do to us. You need to be aware of these ideas to make sure that you are not being a Santa Claus and giving away free elo to your opponents and letting your opponents play stunning tactical shots against you. All of these patterns that I'll be showing you today are things that you absolutely must know. I encourage you to replay the video as many times as you need to until they all feel second nature to you. With each example, I'll also be showing how we got to that position as well. So we'll see the opening and the sequence of moves that got us to that tactical shot. Okay, let's get into the examples. Here is our first example. It comes from a closed Catalan position. Now, I won't be doing a whole bunch of commentary on the opening phase of the game, but I will show the sequence just so you can see how we get to our tactical position. So we have a closed Catalan, both sides castling and developing naturally. We have the queen centralizing to d3. Oftentimes in the Catalan, that black bishop finds itself on a6, targeting this pawn on c4. You see e4 striking at the center, b3 reinforcing, e5, rook d1, queen c7. You see an exchange of pawns and knights, and bishop to b2. We see the queen drop back out of that x-ray against the bishop. e5, so white is playing very aggressively here, again trying to lure that black queen into the bishop's x-ray, where he'd open himself up with some nice tactical shots. And black plays knight to g5. White plays rook to e1. It looks like the purpose of knight g5 was to attack that pawn on e5, right? So white has just shuffled his rook across to e1, thinking that's what he needs to do. He needs to defend his pawn. But have a look at this. The rook slides across, hitting the queen. The queen now relocates to e4, seemingly a nice central square in the middle of the board, protecting the pawn. This looks great for white. No, it is not. Black to play and win. If you need some time, pause the video. Okay, so the crushing sequence for black here is not piling up against this pawn. A lot of white's recent moves in this position have been thinking that the play was all about this point on e5, but actually it's not. The crushing move for black here is bishop to c5. Black is not interested in this advanced pawn on e5. He is going after this weakness here on f2. And it turns out that there's actually a number of things at play here that makes this tactic possible. And if you spotted them all, congratulations to you. Let's have a look at the sequence. Let's say, for example, that white simply moves his rook to f1, thinking, okay, I have things guarded now. Have a look at this. The knight can actually take on f2. We retake it. He takes the rook. And after we retake that bishop, the rook comes in and delivers a devastating check to the king, picking up the loose bishop on b2. Okay, let's go back a few moves and start to unpack the anatomy of this tactic. Here, right, back to our puzzle position where bishop c5 was absolutely crushing. One of the things you need to notice in this position is this bishop here on b2 is loose. Whenever you fianchetto your bishop on the queen side on b2 as white or b7 as black, you need to be aware that in many situations, your queen side fianchettoed bishop is often loose. It's not the case with king side fianchettos. Generally speaking, your bishop on g2 or g7 will be protected by the king, but queen side fianchettos tend to be a bit loose. So in many situations, you can find tactical opportunities arising from a loose queenside fianchetto bishop. That was one clue in the position. The next clue is this rook has vacated f1. Whenever the kingside rook vacates that f square after castling, so f1 for white and f8 for black, we need to be aware that that rook hasn't just activated itself and now it's a great piece. One of the downsides of that move is that you are no longer guarding f2 with a piece. The only guardian of this pawn and this square at the moment is the king. And we know that generally speaking, the king is not a great defender. So these were the two real big tells for you that something is in the air in this position. We have this guy unprotected with pressure, and we have a loose bishop as well. Now the third piece that makes all of this come together is in the last few moves that white has played, where things have gone very wrong for him is that he has completely surrendered the open file to black. The white player thought that what he needed to do in this position was start reinforcing his central pawn. He thought that the entire play was going to revolve around protecting this pawn, so he shuffles off the d file and completely vacates it and surrenders the open file black. So we have three parts here that makes this tactical setup work for black. Okay, let's get straight into our second example. In this game, we have an open Catalan, which is when black takes that pawn on c4. Knight c6, we have the queen coming out to a4 nice and early, looking to recollect that pawn. Bishop b4, we have an exchange of bishops. White jumps forward with his knight to e5. Black castles, we have an exchange of knights. And here, white takes that knight with his bishop. Bishop takes c6. Now, this isn't the position for our tactical examination of this example, but pause the video now and think to yourself what you would play here as black. Would you simply recapture that bishop, or would you play something else? Okay, so we are actually still in opening theory at this stage, and the most common try here for black is not to retake the bishop immediately, but instead we take the central pawn with the queen. The point is that we are striking this loose pawn on b2. If b2 falls, then the rook is in trouble as well. So white does not have time to simply protect his bishop and move it away. That is why in this position, white plays knight to d2. Now black has time to recapture that piece. White jumps forward with his knight, recollecting that pawn on c4 and also defending b2 as well. We have e5, rook d1 hitting the queen drops back to c5, castles, bishop to h3 hitting the rook to e1, rook to b8 and b3. Now this is our tactical position for example number 2. Pause the video here and think about what you would play here as black. It is black to play and win. There is an absolutely crushing sequence here. Okay, if you found the correct sequence, congratulations. It is rook to b4, absolutely crushing. Now, the point is that this queen is running short on squares and she is in a prison. She tries to escape via a6, but the bishop comes back to c8, hitting the queen again. And in this position here, white resigned because anytime the queen tries to escape via a3, this way here, we simply pick up that knight. Your queen is under attack. If you try to recollect the queen, we simply take back and black is up an extra piece, completely winning game. Let's go back and have a think about what made this tactic possible. When black played rook to b8 here, white saw the threat that was coming. He knew what is coming is b4, forking the queen and the knight. So he thought, okay, I will play b3 here. So now when the rook comes forward, my knight will be nicely guarded by a pawn. The problem was, And this is something that you really need to have drilled into your understanding when you're playing 1d4. It is very common for that queen to land on a4 in queen spawn games. In many different openings of 1d4, you will find the queen venturing out to a4 at some point. And you're going on a journey trying to provoke weaknesses and see what can happen. Now, with these little journeys that you go on with your queen from a4, you need to be very careful that your queen does not get trapped there. It is a very common tactical motif in queen spawn games that queens often get themselves trapped in this part of the board, either the white queen or the black queen. In this situation here, it was the white queen that got trapped. So why was b3 such a bad move? The reason for that was it was simply cutting off the queen's natural escape mechanism from that part of the board. And with that avenue locked off, black was able to harass the queen and eventually win the game easily. Okay, let's get into our third example here, which starts off as a Chigoran defense, a very popular opening at the club level actually. So we have d takes c4, white pushes forward with d5, the knight comes around to e5, e4, a nice central structure here by white, black challenges it immediately, f4, have a look at this structure here, the knight jumps in with a check, bishop takes, queen takes, knight f6, the queen comes out now to b5, check, and scoops up this pawn on b7. Another queen journey. Is that queen going to get in trouble? Again, like our previous example. We have bishop to c5, pawn takes on e6, recaptures, e5, striking the knight. The knight comes in to g5. Have a look at this now. The queen drops back. Okay, this is our tactical position for example number 3. It is black to play and win. Pause the video here and have a think about what you would play. Okay, if you found the correct continuation, congratulations. The crushing sequence is actually knight to f2. That square is well guarded by the bishop. We are striking the rook. But White has some ideas. Do they work though? He plays knight to e4. His idea is that, hey, if I can win this bishop, yes, you might take my rook, but your knight's going to be trapped there and I'll eventually win it. So I will get 2 pieces for the rook, which is a good trade for white. Does this work though? No. We have bishop to c6, pinning the knight to the queen. White tries bishop to e3, seeing what he can accomplish here, striking both minor pieces. Black takes the knight on e4, and white scoops up the knight on f2 with his queen. And in this position here is where we have the final killing blow by black. If you didn't spot the entire sequence for black up to this point, that's okay. Pause the video now and try to see if you can spot the final knockout blow. The crushing move here is bishop takes e3, and the point is this: if white recaptures with his queen, then black scoops up g2, the rook is trapped and will be lost next move, so black is completely winning here. Okay, let's go back now and have a look at what happened here. So we started off with another one of these queen journeys here. We started off this time taking a different route. We went via d3 into b5 and scooping up this pawn on b7. Now the problem for white, as it is in many different lines in queen's pawn games, these dark squares around the king, especially f2, when f2, f4 has been played, these points here can become very weak. A bishop from c5, a knight on g5, a potential queen arrival as well. These dark squares can become very vulnerable for white, especially when f4 has been played. And to make matters even worse here, the king was still in the center of the board, and the queen has gone on a nice little journey here as well. So as we play forward through the moves here, the problem was that these dark squares were simply too weak. Okay, let's go into our next example, which is a QGD Tartakova variation, which is very popular at club level as well. So we have h6, the bishop drops back, and b6 as well. So that fianchetto setup from black is what is typical in that Tarkova variation. We have an exchange of bishop for knight, an exchange of central pawns, bishop to e2, bishop e6, castles. I'll play through these moves relatively quickly and we'll get to our tactical position. We have the queen coming out to a4 again, rook d1, c6, the bishop drops back to e2, bishop f5, rook c1, b4. White is looking to prevent black from playing c5 as his break, b4, and the queen comes up into a6. Are you starting to recognize the pattern now? Knight to b6, and white looks to break apart the structure with a4. If he can get this capture going and retake with his knight, the entire black queen side will collapse. But in this position here, black is completely winning. Pause the video and think about what you would play here as black. See if you can spot the continuation. Okay, if you saw the continuation, congratulations. It is, once again, bishop to c8. And the point is this, once again, striking that queen, which is running very short on squares. The queen drops back to a5 to dodge that attack. And the knight jumps in to c4, striking the queen. White takes, but black does not retake the bishop. He slides back to d8, and have a look at that. The queen is completely trapped. Now, I know that we have had a few examples of these queen journeys, but I really wanted to drill it home to the viewers of these videos that when you go on these journeys with your queen, yes, they are a very thematic and topical part of d4 games. You often see the queen working wonders and performing magic on the queen side, but you need to be very aware of the dangers that come with these journeys as well. You need to be very aware that in some situations your queen can get trapped. And if there's one thing that we accomplish from these videos is to prevent you guys from getting your queens trapped, okay? So let's go back once again and have a look at how this happened, because it all seemed very logical from White's perspective. And this wasn't a weak player playing with the white pieces as well. We're talking about someone rated over 2200. So very logical play here. He plays b4, looking to prevent c5. We have b5 from black, which is a pretty common setup in a lot of QGD lines. We have the knight looking to install itself on c4, where it acts as a bit of a plug, blocking up that c file. So very thematic play so far. All looks very logical. And now, in this situation, the mistake that the white player made was actually venturing up with his queen. This is where the game became unrescuable. What the white player needed to do was to acknowledge that venturing forward with the queen was too dangerous, and he needed to see the possibility of that queen getting trapped there. Dropping back to b3 was the more logical approach here. Instead, he steps forward, looking to break apart that structure and completely destroy black's queen side. And yes, if he accomplishes that, he is in a terrific situation and black's entire setup would collapse like a house of cards. But remember, we need to be aware when we go on these little journeys with our queens and we start getting boxed in, right? This is not a good pattern. We need to drill this in. The bishop slots back to c8 and it's game over very quickly here. Okay, let's dive into our next example, which is a Tarrasch defense, which can be a very, very tricky and tactical line that catches out a lot of players, especially when you're new to d4. It can be a very tricky line. We have g3 set up from white, which is the most common nowadays. Knight f6, bishop g2, bishop e7. We have both sides castling. An interesting bishop e3 from white here. Bishop g4. We have an exchange of bishop for the knight. We have the queen tickling the loose h3 point. White defends, centralizing the rook. Bishop g5. The knight jumps forward. We have an exchange of bishops. white captures on c5, and now we have an isolated queen's pawn for black. And white lines up his rook against the queen, so seemingly very logical play here. And in this position here, there is a tactical opportunity here for black. So pause the video here and have a think about what you would play for black. So what is possible here for black is to take this pawn on g3 with his knight. Notice that the queen is pinning the f-pawn, right? So the f-pawn cannot recapture that knight. Whenever you have a fianchettoed bishop and you have pushed forward with h3, you need to be aware of this pattern because you often have a black piece making itself available on this diagonal here, be it a bishop on c5, the queen on c5, maybe a queen on b6. This diagonal here is often very accessible to the black pieces. So when you have this configuration here, it can be very tender and you can have a lot of tactical opportunities here of taking on g3. So that was the first point. Now, in our example game here, white tried this fancy looking knight to e4. He has a crushing idea. He has just unleashed his rook on the queen, and his knight is also hitting this loose black knight on g3 as well. His idea is simple. If black simply moves his queen away from the rook, he picks up that piece and he's up a piece, very happy. What did he overlook? In this position here, it is black to play and win. Pause your video now and find the absolutely crushing sequence. Okay, if you spotted it, congratulations. The absolutely crushing queen takes c1 here. And in this position here, white resigned. The point is this: if we simply retake the queen, the black knight jumps into e2, forking the king and queen, and after the king moves, he picks up the queen. And the point is this: after that black knight is recaptured, we have a loose knight here on e4. And black is up an entire rook and some loose change as well, so completely winning position. Okay, let's go back, because for those that are tactically sharp, they would have noticed that after the black knight took on g3, actually this wasn't the end of the story, right? In the game, we saw knight to e4, which turned out to be a horrible blunder that allowed this incredible queen sacrifice and the fork. But instead of knight e4, there was a more interesting try here from white. Pause the video here and think about what you would play here as white instead of knight e4. Okay, so the simple and quiet rook to e1 is actually a fantastic move here, which keeps the game in balance. Now the point is this: in the previous variation that we looked at, the problem wasn't really that the queen was taking on c1. The problem was that after the queen took on c1, we had this fork. The knight picks up the queen after that fork check. So with rook e1, we guard e2, so that fork is no longer available. So now our knight is free to move. We can start hopping around and unleash this rook onto the queen. And not only that, we have so much pressure on this central pawn here. So yes, black took this pawn on g3, but we will be recapturing a central pawn as well, and black will have a lot of problems to deal with himself as well. So if we go back to our initial position here, if you spotted that knight to g3 was possible, but actually white had an interesting counter with the simple and quiet rook to e1, congratulations, you have a very sharp tactical eye. Okay, on to our next example, which is the Alban counter gambit, which I know terrorizes a lot of people who are new to d4. So let's see how this game plays out. We have white going for his trusted fianchetto setup. Black looks to recapture the pawn. We have knight d2, bishop e7, knight b3. We have an exchange of knights, bishop f6. The knight comes up into c5, a nice advanced position. Castles, queen to b3, queen to e7, and knight takes b7. Have a look at this. White's idea was that by capturing the pawn here, he is unleashing his bishop onto c6, which is now loose. So black leaps forward to e5 as his knight was loose. White drops his bishop back to g2. And in this position here, believe it or not, we are only 14 moves into the game, and it is black to move and win. Pause the video here and see how you would continue here as black. Okay, if you found the continuation, congratulations, it is rook to b8. And as simple as that, that knight is lost. The point is this, black will be playing c5 next, regardless of what white does, opening up a third attacker onto that piece, and there is no way for white to add a third defender. At the moment, white has got 2 defenders on that knight. Currently, black has got 2 attackers. Once c5 pushes forward, the queen will be a third attacker, and that knight will be lost. It's as simple as that. White has lost a piece. Okay, let's go back and reinforce this pattern into our minds. So the real issue wasn't necessarily taking on b7. In this position here, the engine really wanted white to drop his knight back to d3 and play positionally. But taking on b7 wasn't the end of the world. After black hops forward with his knight, attacking the bishop, what white needed to do was immediately acknowledge that there is going to be an issue here. The rook is coming onto b8, and after black plays c5, that knight will be in serious trouble. White just needed to acknowledge that and immediately escape with his knight. Right now, it was his only chance. Instead, he saw that the knight was attacking his bishop, looking to potentially damage that structure. He dropped his bishop back, but that was a tempo that white did not have the luxury of. He did not have time to drop that bishop back. He needed to escape immediately with his knight, and that was the issue. Okay, so in some of our previous examples, we saw a lot of queen journeys from a4. We saw some interesting journeys to b7 as well. And now we're seeing the queen getting into trouble again on b3. Now, I'm not trying to scare people from using their queen. It is a very powerful piece. What I'm trying to do is to open up your eyes into the possible dangers of having your queen out in the open like this, and the various tactical possibilities that it opens up for your opponent. Yes, you need to use your queen. She is a very powerful piece, but you also need to be very careful. Okay, on to our next example, which once again comes from a QGD. So let's go through the opening phase relatively quickly. We have bishop g5, h6, we have an exchange of bishop for knight. The queen comes out to c2. Black goes for an early c5 strike in the center, and bishop to e2, so fairly timid approach here from white. Knight to c6. We have an exchange in the center, c takes d, and black mimics the exchange. White retakes, and black retakes. And now we have both sides with an isolated queen's pawn. Rook to d1. White is looking to protect his IQP. Bishop to g4. And knight to e5. White jumps in. We have an exchange of light square bishops. And in this position here, believe it or not, we are 14 moves in. And it is black to move and have an absolutely crushing advantage. Black to move and win. Pause the video here and think about what you do here as black. Now, the entire sequence of this challenge is actually quite a tricky one and could even challenge players of rating up to 2200 to see everything through to the end here. So pause the video and challenge yourself to see if you can find the crushing continuation here. Okay, if you managed to spot the continuation, congratulations. There is the crushing knight takes d4. Have a look at this. White retakes that knight, and after bishop takes, it turns out that white can't simply retake that bishop because the king is still in the center of the board. White recapturing the bishop would simply lose the queen to rook to e8. But what happens after we simply drop the rook back with the idea of sliding the rook across and shielding our queen? Well, we still come in with rook to e8, and after white shuffles across to e3 to shield the queen, we have the crushing pawn to d4, forking the rook and the knight. White takes the bishop, and after this exchange, black takes the knight on c3, and this is the tricky position here. You needed to be able to see the absolute crushing game-ending move right here. On the surface of things, it might look fine. We have equal material. Both sides have a queen and a rook and 5 pawns. Okay, white's pawn structure is slightly more damaged than black's, but you might think this isn't the end of the world. But actually, this position is absolutely crushing for black for only one continuation. There is one crushing continuation here for black that puts the game to rest. If you saw things through to the end, congratulations. If you didn't, try pausing the video at this point here and see what black plays in this position to absolutely destroy white. Okay, the quiet but deadly queen to d3. Have a look at this. There is an absolutely crushing threat here of simply dropping the queen back and scooping up the rook. The only thing that white can even think about potentially doing here is, say, dropping the queen back, but we give the check anyway. If white interposes, we slide across with our rook, and it's game over. So congratulations if you managed to spot that absolutely crushing strike, queen to d3. What a move. Okay, let's go back and quickly just unpack the critical point in that game from a tactical pattern perspective. It was this point here. We needed to see that the queen and the king were lined up on a completely open file, which is currently only clogged up by the knight. And the knight's anchor point is this pawn here on d4. And this pattern can come up quite often, as in many d4 queen's pawn games, you find yourself in these strange situations where both sides actually have an IQP, and in situations where one side has been a bit slow to get their king to safety and found themselves in an unfortunate situation of having their queen and king lined up like this, you can have tactical shots like this where you sever the knight's anchor point and look to take advantage of that configuration of the queen and the king lined up like that. Okay, on to our next example here, which starts off from an English opening move order, but we quickly transpose into typical QGD Tarrasch type setups here. So we have e3, we have an exchange, bishop e7, knight f3, castles, a3, knight c6. We'll quickly go through the opening moves here. We've got the queen venturing out to b6, castles from white. Now, this isn't our main tactical position from this example, but pause the video here and ask the question to yourself, can black take this pawn on b2? Okay, so for those who wanted to leap forward with their queen, here is black, and take that pawn on b2, well, you need to drill this pattern into your memory because the simple knight to a4 here traps the queen. There is absolutely nowhere for that queen to go. Every single square is covered. Have a look at that. There is nowhere for that queen to go. So you'd be losing your queen here. So black absolutely cannot take that pawn, which is why in this position here, white was able to simply castle. Okay, let's continue forward. Rook to d8. He drops his bishop back to e3, protecting his pawn on d4, knight d5, queen e2, bishop f6, striking the queen, queen to c7, and the knight hops into c5. We have knight f4, striking the queen. We have an exchange. White pushes forward with d5, and we have an exchange of pawns here. Now, we won't do a video pause here because I'm sure that everyone can see rook takes bishop would be met with the crushing checkmate in one here, back rank issues. So instead, black plays bishop to g4, and white plays rook to d1. Simply guarding his bishop here. Believe it or not, in this position, which seems safe enough for white, we have symmetrical pawn structures, we have equal material. White is completely castled, he has his pieces out and developed. He has nice centralization with his pieces. What can possibly be wrong with the position here? Well, believe it or not, in this position, black is completely winning. Pause your video here and see if you can spot the absolutely crushing sequence here for black. Okay, congratulations if you spotted this pattern. It is the very pretty knight to d4. Have a look at this. We are striking the queen. We have blocked the rook's protection to the bishop. That knight is now acting as a wedge. The bishop is now loose. Not only that, we are striking the knight on f3, threatening to completely destroy white's kingside structure. But more importantly, the queen is under attack. So a lot of problems to solve here for white. So white tries queen to e4. He thinks he's got everything under control here. Now, if you didn't see things all the way up to this point, try pausing the video at this point here and see if you can find the absolutely crushing continuation here. That's right, it is rook takes d5. Look at this. White retakes with the queen, and now the simple knight to f3 check is absolutely game ending. White retakes, bishop takes, striking the queen. White moves his queen, offering an exchange. Black, of course, says no thanks, gives the check. White has to interpose, and we simply scoop up that rook. We are up a rook for nothing, and we are winning here as black. Okay, well, there we have it. Congratulations for those who made it all the way through to the end of the video and challenged themselves to finding those crushing continuations. I hope that you got a lot out of those examples. I hope that your queen is much safer now. I hope that your king is much safer now. And I hope that by surviving some of these tactical, sharp ideas that black has against us in d4, that you can then play your own tactical, crushing continuations against your opponent. Good luck in your games, and thanks for watching the video.